G. Rose here, and today we're going to be talking about a paper called Compelling. And the main question that the paper asks is, why does one person find X compelling and another person find Y compelling? Why does one person feel convinced by the evidence for case X and another person feel convinced for the case for Y? You got people who are convinced that abortion is wrong, and you got other people that are convinced it's good. Well, why? Why is one person convinced by the evidence one way and another person convinced another? What makes something compelling? And think about if you, say, are reading a paper about, say, COVID-19. Why is it that some ideas stick out to you and you go, oh, yeah, that's a good idea? And why is it when you read other ideas you go, no, that's not believable? Like, there are things that kind of stick out and there are things that don't stick out. Well, why is that? And a lot of what we're going to talk about is how we find compelling, something compelling relative to who we are, and it's similar enough to what we already think that we can relate to it. If we encounter an idea that's true, but it's totally out of left field, it's very difficult for us to find it compelling because there's nothing in us to find it compelling. And so we're kind of locked in our subjectivity. But, the other thing we've got to be careful on, though, is there's a tendency to conflate subjective with wrong. If we didn't have subjectivity, we couldn't observe anything. Subjectivity makes possible finding things compelling or observing things. So the fact that it's subjective, you can be subjective and right. And if you're objective, where, that comes from object, if you're an object, then you don't have much life, there's not much emotion, there's not much color. And do we really think that we have a better view of life without subjectivity, without all the elements that color it? If you're experiencing a human being as objective, you're just going to experience them as a body. And are you really going to know them very well? You're missing, you're going to miss everything that makes them who they are. So there is the paper is going to say you have to have a self and a person, an identity in order to find something compelling, and what you find compelling is going to be relative to that. But of course, this is a problem because if you're genuinely trying to investigate the other side and trying to, not just be locked in your own framework, well, how are you going to do it? What's your sorting mechanism going to be? We tend to sort good ideas from bad ideas relative to what's compelling, but if that's inevitably linked up to who we are, how are we going to sort good arguments of the other side from bad arguments of the other side? That's really quite difficult, and it seems like it has to be this kind of gradual development for us to figure it out. So this also suggests that even when we're trying to get views we disagree with, there's probably going to be mechanisms of self-deception that are phenomenologically going to operate in a way that makes us not realize the self-deception is there. If you know you're being deceived, then you're not deceived, right? So likewise, a self-deception you are conscious of is not one that is self-deception. Objects don't find things compelling. A ball doesn't find something compelling. People do. And I think it's also important to realize that when we talk about objective versus subjective, I don't think people are ever 100% objective or 100% subjective. We tend to be, 42% objective and 58% subjective, like a mixture between these two. And so again, it's when we say objective truth, what does that exactly mean? It's just truth, right? Objective truth, like you observe, like it's something that an object would observe. I know what people mean. They mean that it's a truth that doesn't change relative to who observes it. A subjective truth is one that is indivisible from the observer. And I get that. But if something is true and you observe it subjectively as itself, then the fact that you view it subjectively does not change its facticity, its truthfulness. So we do have to be careful with these words, subjective and objective, because those words seem to describe something more like a disposition to phenomena in the world as opposed to the degree by which something is valid or invalid. The paper is also going to point out that the worldview we hold to is probably one we simply absorbed from our birth, from where we come from. It's just one we absorbed. It's probably not one that we were convinced into. Now, that doesn't mean it's wrong, which is very important. Just because you absorb a truth does not mean it is incorrect. But if we ask other people to, if we argue with someone that they're wrong, or we ask someone to justify their view, we do need to realize that we're probably holding them up to a standard that we ourselves don't even meet when it comes to our own worldview. We're asking people to be convinced to an argument when we ourselves we probably just absorbed our argument. Now, not necessarily. I mean, if you start off your whole life as a Marxist and you become a capitalist or vice versa, that would be an example where you were convinced into capitalism. So it's not. I'm not to say that everyone's view is absorbed. It's just the case that it probably is. It's just natural. Absorbing views is natural. Being convinced into views is unnatural. So we do need to recognize that when we are asking someone to find something compelling, or arguing with someone, or debating, or whatever, we might be holding them to a standard that we ourselves did not even meet, yet we think we met it. Because nobody thinks their view is just merely absorbed. They tend to think that they've thought about it, and that it's grounded and justified, when it probably isn't as justified as they think. Now, that doesn't mean it's wrong. You can have a view that you've never thought about, and it could still happen to be right. But it is important to recognize that a lot of stuff, we tend to absorb as opposed to be convinced into. Now, of course, we have to also get into questions of how do we identify a truth that has a higher likelihood to be actually true as opposed to one we just think is true. There's a small list in the paper. Is it, where we'll ask, is the truth one that is limited to a single area, or is it easily transferable? If you can transfer it, that would give you reasons to think that it is it's probably true, because you can move it between arenas without it vanishing. Is it an idea that you can actually practice? Because if you can practice it, then you can falsify it. Is it non-hierarchical? Because the world doesn't have hierarchies in it. The humans create hierarchies. We perceive hierarchies onto the world. So if the idea entails hierarchy, then it is probably something. Then it's going to necessarily entail a human element to it that might be unreliable. Now, this isn't to say hierarchy is innately bad. It would just depend on what hierarchy you're talking about, but hierarchy can be a problem. Also, if the idea moralizes, if it creates that this is right and this is wrong, different values, that doesn't mean that the idea is wrong, but if it's moralizing, that would be further evidence that you're dealing with something that's subjective. And then if the idea lacks any justified premises, if there's no justified premises, that doesn't mean it's wrong, but the fact that it doesn't have, though, would give you reason to question it. So anyway, the paper is going to go a lot through questions of why we find something compelling, something not compelling, and it's all going to be a lead up to a very long paper called The Conflict of Mind. But for now, this has been OG Rose. For more, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.